In the cold tapestry of the Second World War, certain places became more than just geographical coordinates. They transformed into sepulchres of ambition, non-return points etched onto a map of history. And nowhere was this transformation as brutal and definitive as in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942. On that frigid January dawn in 1943, as the siege tightened on the distant, desolate bank of the Volga, the truth, icy and relentless, finally began to penetrate the concrete walls of Berlin, thousands of kilometers away, in the strategic heart of the regime. The war, which had been imagined as a rapid and inevitable blitzkrieg of triumph, now dragged on as a bloody burden, and its weight fell upon the city that the German leader had named after his adversary. Stalingrad, for propaganda and for the regime's psychology, was more than a vital industrial city. It was a symbol of will, an anchor for the narrative of invincibility that sustained the entire war effort. The capture of Stalingrad would mean not only access to the oil fields of the Caucasus, but the complete humiliation of the ideological enemy. The price, however, was becoming astronomical, paid not just in lives, but in credibility. The summer and autumn had been a fever of optimism. The German units had advanced deep into enemy territory with breakneck speed, carrying with them the almost mystical belief that victory was a right. In Berlin, initial reports were filtered through a fanatical desire, transforming difficulties into challenges and tactical defeats into course corrections. Reality, however, is like the Volga ice. Eventually it cracks, and the fissure began to spread in mid-November, when the enemy launched Operation Uranus. This counteroffensive, executed with surprising strategic coldness, did not attack Stalingrad directly, but targeted the weaker, poorly equipped flanks comprised of allied Romanian and Italian units. Within days, the powerful German Sixth Army, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, found itself completely surrounded. A mass of about 300,000 men trapped in the freezing crater of the city, without supplies, without cover, and under the watchful eye of the Russian winter, the most feared and relentless of generals. In the Führer bunker, reality was fought with hysteria and inflexibility. The German leader had issued a categorical order: hold the line and fight to the last man. This order, seemingly an act of unbreakable bravery, was, in fact, an act of strategic desperation and psychological stubbornness. Abandoning Stalingrad would mean the first admission of a catastrophe of enormous proportions, which was unthinkable for the architecture of power based on infallibility. The immediate consequence was the sacrifice of an entire army in the name of a symbol. The logistical situation soon transformed into the central drama of the tragedy. The only hope for the besieged troops was an improvised airlift, to be maintained by the Luftwaffe. Air Marshal Hermann Göring, in an excess of confidence or delusion, assured the leader that the task was possible. The numbers, however, were glaring. The Sixth Army needed at least 500 tons of supplies per day to survive and maintain fighting capability. The airlift, on its best days and under almost impossible weather conditions, barely managed to deliver 100 tons. The difference between the promise and the reality was the distance between life and death for tens of thousands of soldiers. In this frozen hell, the air smelled of gunpowder and exhaustion. The silence, when it came, was more terrifying than the shelling, for it meant the enemy was regrouping, or worse, closing in. The men in the encirclement were fighting not only against the adversary, but against hunger, typhus, and above all the biting cold, which turned every wound into a death sentence and every breath into an agony. The hardest war for many was the one they fought within themselves, between blind obedience and the growing awareness that they had been abandoned. In Berlin, the veil of lies began to tear in the intelligence rooms and operations offices. Each day, the reports from the front became more desperate, more laconic, with fewer requests for ammunition and more pathetic pleas for food, rations, or simply a clear order that would break the silence and isolation. The general staff officers, men trained in the relentless logic of military strategy, were now engaged in the absurd task of justifying the unjustifiable, the deliberate annihilation of one of their most decorated armies. The moral dilemma was palpable. The military high command knew what strategic logic demanded: a withdrawal, or at least an attempt to break the encirclement, even at an extremely high cost. But the leaders' will was absolute: To break, that was to risk their own lives and those of their families. To obey was to sign the death warrant of 300,000 men, besides irreversibly compromising the course of the war in the East. Between loyalty to a man and loyalty to the army and country, many retreated into silent obedience, perhaps hoping that a miracle or a last-minute decision would save them. The rescue attempt, Operation Winter Storm, launched in December by troops commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was the last desperate chance. The advance, though initially promising, stalled just over 60 kilometers from the encirclement perimeter. The Sixth Army, exhausted and paralyzed by the lack of fuel and Paulus's stubbornness in following the order not to move, failed to make the breakout effort to meet the relief force. When Manstein's force was compelled to withdraw under heavy enemy pressure, the door of hope closed forever. The fate of the Sixth Army was sealed, awaiting only the formality of its final execution. In this period of extreme tension, the voices of those involved, often silenced by the propaganda machine, survive in fragments and annotations. The war was not just about maps and arrows, but about individuals trapped in a collective tragedy. A German soldier, camped in a makeshift shelter, wrote a letter that would never be sent, an echo of conscience captured on paper. The cold here is not weather, it is a weapon. Our fingers no longer feel the metal of the rifle, nor the mass of the bread. Sometimes I wonder if the commander-in-chief in Berlin still knows the difference between snow and heated marble. The historian comments, the distance between the headquarters and the front was measured not in kilometers, but in comfort and denial. This disconnection, this inability of Berlin to feel the pain of the common soldier, was the fatal error. War, after all, is made of reality, not rhetoric. In an internal report, a junior intelligence officer, working in the shadows of Berlin, noted a brief and terrible realization after analyzing the latest communications. January losses already exceed the total wounded and dead from the entire French campaign. To continue is madness. Surrender is inevitable. Berlin must prepare for the final verdict. The historian reflects, it is at this moment that military bureaucracy confronts human catastrophe. A report, dry in its numbers, reveals a moral abyss. Losses and dead cease to be statistics and become the bankruptcy of a system. The inevitability, handwritten and almost illegible, is the sound of destiny knocking at the door. A civilian resident of Berlin, whose life was shielded from the snow and bullets but not from the lies, recorded a revealing entry in their diary based on rumors that were beginning to pierce the censorship blockade. There is a strange silence on radios, and the newspapers talk much about heroism and little about progress. The bell of Stalingrad, they say, has stopped tolling. I fear that the silence is what awaits us. The historian concludes, the bell, in popular metaphor, was the heart of the news. When the propaganda machine fails to produce sounds of triumph, the void is filled with fear. The civilian, the distant observer, realizes that the real war is not just on the front, but in the darkness of uncertainty that Berlin desperately tried to illuminate with empty promises. The refusal to accept the withdrawal and the insistence on the siege transformed Stalingrad into a colossal mousetrap. The German leader had become his own prisoner. His generals, bound by oath and fear, became passive accomplices to a disaster foretold. The situation of Marshal Paulus, besieged in Stalingrad, became the mirror of Berlin's dilemma. He sent messages requesting freedom of action, the right to attempt a breakout. Berlin's response was always the same: hold the position. In an act of cruel and dehumanizing irony, the German leader promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th, 1943. The implicit message was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was not an honor, but a final pressure for suicide, or at least for fighting to total annihilation. On that day, January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the regime's rise to power, while the capital celebrated a farce of past triumphs, the heart of the Sixth Army stopped beating in the frozen skull of Stalingrad. Paulus's final refusal to commit suicide and his eventual surrender the next day was a turning point, not just military but psychological, that Berlin was forced to swallow. The silence that followed the interruption of communications from Stalingrad was the final verdict. Propaganda tried to spin the event as a heroic sacrifice, but the truth resonated louder than military marches. An entire army had been lost, signifying the loss of strategic initiative and, for many, the loss of the war itself. For the first time in over 3 years of conflict, the narrative of invincibility that had been the fuel of the regime was irreparably broken. The smoke of Stalingrad hung not only over the Volga, but over the offices of Berlin, bringing with it the foul smell of failure and the grim recognition that the course of the war would no longer be decided by blind will, but by the brutal arithmetic of logistics and winter. From then on, the German machine would be perpetually on the defensive, chasing an enemy that had found its soul in the tragedy of Stalingrad. The cost of this delayed recognition was the army of 300,000 men, and the price of failure in accepting reality would be the loss of the entire war. The turning point was not just the siege itself, but the moment when, in the darkness of the war room, someone in Berlin had to erase the Sixth Army from the map. The final verdict of Stalingrad reached Berlin not with the noise of collapse, but with the silence of a radio that stopped transmitting. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. The last voice of the Sixth Army fell silent. From that day on, the German leadership was forced to face the truth that the war would no longer be won by sheer will, but by the non-negotiable demands of reality. The central dilemma, extending from the command room to the frozen front, was no longer about military strategy. It was about the nature of obedience in a totalitarian regime. When loyalty becomes a prison, what remains of freedom? Stalingrad exposed the failure of military logic in the face of leadership that demanded total, irrational sacrifice. The generals, trained to preserve fighting strength, were compelled to destroy themselves in the name of an abstract principle of honor and infallibility. This was the moral burden that Berlin had to bear, attempting to justify the deaths of hundreds of thousands of men as a moral victory. Propaganda worked frantically to transform the disaster into a myth. National mourning was decreed, and the loss was presented as the greatest sacrifice in German history, an act of selflessness that would hold the rest of the Eastern Front. The reality, however, is that the annihilation of the Sixth Army ripped a massive hole in the German battle line, a vacuum that the remaining troops could not fill without compromising their entire defensive posture. From that moment, the initiative passed definitively to the enemy. They could choose where and when to strike. The German forces merely reacted, in a desperate and continuous effort to plug holes and prevent total collapse. The strategic climax, therefore, was not a tank battle, but the moment of silent acceptance in Berlin, the decision to maintain the siege until surrender, against all common sense and all sensible military advice, revealed the rigidity and self-destructiveness of the regime. That moment marked the transition from offensive, triumphalist warfare to defensive, attritional warfare, which Germany lacked the resources to win. The echo of the Stalingrad tragedy reverberates beyond strategic maps, finding resonance in unsent letters and the whispers of the home front. A fragment of a later intelligence report, focused on troop morale, carried a tone of resignation previously unthinkable. Our forces have learned to distinguish loyalty from stupidity. The soldier who survived on other fronts has lost faith that victory is possible, retaining only the hope that survival is still a right. The historian comments, "The loss of faith in victory is more devastating than the loss of any battle." This change in troop morale, this distinction between loyalty and stupidity, is the death certificate of an ideology. From then on, many fought only out of the instinct for self-preservation, not for the cause. A diary entry from a surviving civilian living near Berlin, reflecting the shift in the air, states, "The speeches are no longer about conquering Europe, but about final resistance." The tone has shifted from swaggering to somber. It is as if the city itself knows that, in the East, we lost more than soldiers. We lost the future. The historian reflects, when the language of regime begins to speak of resistance instead of triumph, the defeat is already being digested by society. The human instinct catches this change in the tone of voice. The future, which was a certainty, transformed into a painful question. From an internal note, recovered in a General Staff archive, intended for a logistics officer, a short sentence survives. From February, the focus is no longer on advance, but on the integrity of the supply line. We must fight for every meter of railway, not of territory. The historian concludes, The focus on logistics rather than conquest is the formal recognition of defeat. War ceases to be an epic and becomes a desperate calculation of resources and supply lines. The battle for territory transforms into the battle for fuel, for bread, for the rail track. This is a cold, prosaic reality that Berlin was forced to accept, and in that acceptance lies the true cost of Stalingrad. The strategic outcome was a transition to total defense. The loss at Stalingrad drained vital resources from the entire Eastern Front, and the regime never managed to fully regain momentum, nor completely replace the material and, crucially, the experienced body of officers lost. The Sixth Army was the cream of the German mechanized infantry. Its destruction meant the irretrievable loss of large-scale combat experience. From 1943 onwards, German forces were gradually pushed back, fighting a rear-guard action that grew more violent and desperate with each passing month. The contrast between tactical triumph and moral loss has never been so evident. Stalingrad was a monumental strategic victory for the enemy, which not only secured access to the Volga, but, crucially, showed the world that the German army could be encircled, annihilated, and forced to surrender. The resilience and capacity for sacrifice demonstrated in the siege, celebrated by German propaganda, could not compensate for the material and human loss. The regime gained a story of tragic heroism to tell, but lost the war in the East. Stalingrad, in its brutal coldness, is not just a record of military siege. It is a supreme case study on the danger of strategic inflexibility and moral collapse. It was a moment when reality, in the form of Russian winter and human stubbornness, brought down the fantasy of invincibility that fed Berlin. The refusal to admit error, the insistence on sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives in the name of a whim, not only sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, but compromised the entire war effort. What does Stalingrad teach us about human nature? Perhaps it reminds us that power, when unaccompanied by wisdom and empathy, becomes a self-destructive weapon. Courage was not just in fighting in the ruins, but in having the moral authority to say no to an order that would lead to disaster. Field Marshal Paulus, by surrendering, made the choice that Berlin could not. He stopped the bloodshed, even at the cost of his formal honor, and thereby, unintentionally, attested to the ethical bankruptcy of command that demanded death over reason. The legacy of Stalingrad is the eternal reminder that no ideology, however powerful it imagines itself to be, can annul the laws of arithmetic, logistics, and humanity. The most difficult conflict is the one fought in the operations room, where the leader must decide between preserving his image and preserving the lives of his men. Berlin failed that fundamental test. The belated acceptance of the Stalingrad verdict was not an act of humility, but the forced recognition that the most relentless enemy was the ignored reality itself. That winter in 1943 was the point where the tide irreversibly turned. The snow did not just erase the footprints of the soldiers who never returned. It sealed in an era of advance and marked the beginning of the slow, painful, and inevitable march toward defeat. And today, the cold echo of Stalingrad still resonates in humanity's memory, a grim testament to the price paid when blind ambition collides with inflexible truth. The wind blows over the Volga, and the silence that remains is the greatest of all monuments to the lost.